Hi there, this is Dan from MX5 Sideways Miata Specialist, and we're going to be doing a 99 Miata alternator replacement today. Go ahead and disconnect the negative battery terminal from your battery. That'll be a 13mm nut if you've got an aftermarket terminal like this one, or if you're on a stock terminal, it'll be a 10mm nut. Now once you got that removed, we're going to head up to the front of the car and pop the hood, go in the engine bay. We're going to need to first disconnect the intake manifold support brace. So we've got two bolts right there that you're going to want to go after, and there's some hoses in the way. On this car we've got this big blue coolant reroute hose that's in the way, and on your Miata you probably won't have that, but you'll have some other hoses and stuff, so it's important to use a 14mm socket that has an extension like this one, about a foot long extension that'll really help you clear past all that stuff that's in the way and give you easy access to those two bolts. So your setup should look something like this. Now once you've gone ahead and you got those two bolts removed, take out the extension, just take that deep 14mm socket and then lift up the car. Once you got the car lifted and support it very well with two jack stands, give it a little shake, make sure it's not going to tip over. Then you can go ahead and head underneath once you feel comfortable. Taking that deep 14mm socket, you're going to want to head in here to the last bolt holding the intake manifold support brace on. Now as long as you're using a deep socket here, you should easily clear the edges of the manifold support brace and be able to loosen that bolt. And we'll get that manifold support brace out of here in just a second. Pulls down nice and easily, cleared through. Alright, now for this next step we want to make sure that you've disconnected the battery because we're going to be working with live wires. So take your 13mm bolt, or 12mm if you're dealing with an aftermarket alternator, and you want to loosen that power terminal on top of the alternator. That's a live wire headed straight to the battery, so you'll give yourself a pretty nasty shock if you haven't disconnected the battery before you're working with it. Some cars have a plastic cover you'll need to pop off, but this car's aftermarket alternator did not have the plastic cover installed. The ECU connector here is broken on this car, so I'm going to be removing that a little bit later. So we're heading up and we're going to take a look at the tensioner on top of the alternator now. We've got a tensioning bolt there, and then we have a locking bolt here. We're going to be referring to these a couple times. So that one sets the tension, and the other one is the one that locks the alternator in place right there. So once you've removed that little assembly, it'll look something like this. You're going to want to basically loosen in stages, going back and forth between those two bolts, not putting too much stress on either one. Now, as we head back up underneath the car, we're going to go after the long bolt that holds the bottom of the alternator to the block. This one prevents pivoting of the alternator, and it can be on there pretty tight. The easiest way to remove this with common hand tools is to grab a 14mm box end wrench and slip it over the end there. Now, this bolt can be on pretty tight, so it can take a little bit of extra leverage to help get it loose. You may be able to loosen it just like this, but you may have some difficulty. And if you do have difficulty, just go ahead and grab another wrench, like a 15mm, 16mm, whatever you got around. Loop it over the end just like this, and that'll double your reach, double the amount of torque you can put on that bolt, and really help you get it loose nice and easily. Now once you got that bolt unthreaded about halfway, the rest of the way it should just pull straight out, because as you see here, the threads only go about halfway down the bolt. So once you see that you've got the end of the bolt, sitting about halfway right there, just give it a good yank. It can be seized up a little bit. It'll come out the rest of the way. Now with that bolt removed, you should see that the alternator pivots pretty easily now. What you'll want to do is pivot the alternator, and then you'll be able to pop the belt off pretty easily right there. Now, with the belt disconnected, we're going to move on toward actually inspecting the belt. Looking at the belt, you're going to look for cracks, you're going to look for glazing, which looks shiny, and this belt, even though it's not brand new, was in pretty good shape, so we decided to reuse it. Now you can just kind of grab the alternator and yank it out. Be careful if you weren't able to disconnect that ECU connector that we talked about earlier. I just spun the alternator around here to see the ECU connector visible. Now in this car, I gave it a really good yank, and it was just absolutely stuck. So I just had to go ahead and grab some pliers and squeeze that little thumb tab to help get it off more easily. I've never had this issue with working on a Miata's alternator before, so something could have been damaged inside the connector. Getting the alternator down out of the car, relatively easy after that process. So you're going to want to take the alternator and give it a little bit of a spin. You can check the bearings here. You want to make sure that they're not too gravelly, and everything spins smoothly. Now if it spins smoothly, you can go ahead and take it to a shop to have it tested. They'll hook up to those leads and they'll check the voltage output and let you know if your alternator tests good or if it's definitely bad. I know this alternator is bad, so I'm going to grab the new one. Take it out of here and take any of this paper that comes on it off. Looks a whole lot nicer than those old ones. So we're going to orient the alternator just the way that it sits normally in the car, with this one tab in the top left corner and these two tabs in the bottom right corner. This way it'll be easy to keep track of everything as we load it up into the car. And here I've popped it right in and got the lawn bolt that we're going to install first. So everything's done in reverse order here. We're going to slide that lawn bolt through and thread it in, but not tighten it down all the way. We want to leave some of the ability for the alternator to pivot. So once you can see the tip of the bolt sticking through that hole on the front of the alternator, you're going to stop tightening. Just leave it right there, not too tight, while we install this tensioning assembly. So as far as the tensioning assembly, we're going to do a little bit of prep here. First thing you're going to do is loosen that tensioning bolt, the one that goes through the tensioner. Loosen it all the way. Get it all the way down. That'll give us the most wiggle room when we're installing the alternator and make sure that things go in easily and smoothly. Now once you've gone ahead and you've gotten that one loosened all the way, you're going to take the locking bolt and just remove it completely. We'll install this one after we have the tensioner assembly in the car. So set that aside and head down in there with that tensioning assembly and try and set it up just the way it was before. So we want that hump on the top, the threaded section on the bottom. Go ahead and notch the bolt head into the notch on the bracket. Take the tensioner assembly, put it under that coolant hose, and you should be able to see that threaded section for the locking bolt peeking out right there through the slot. And it takes a little bit of fiddling. You really want to make sure you've got that bolt head in the notch that's cut out for it in that bracket. And once you have that, go ahead and grab the alternator with your other hand, something I don't have available, and swing the alternator up, put the locking bolt straight through. Now you don't want to tighten that locking bolt yet. We've got to set the alternator tension first with the tensioning bolt. So leave the locking bolt a little bit loose and go ahead and just tighten that tensioner bolt right there. But before we actually set that tension, we're going to want to take the belt and slide it over the alternator. So once we've got that belt over the alternator, we want to check the alignment on those other pulleys. We've got that main cranked pulley down there as well as the water pump pulley up here. So just go ahead and follow that belt around and check on the bottom as well. And for example, right here, we've got the belt misaligned. You can see some pulley teeth showing, and we're just going to slide it over. Should be pretty easy to work with because we haven't tensioned up the belt yet. So once we've got it all set, you can tell it's straight on all the pulleys. You'll see that we've got a fair bit of slack here, and we're going to eliminate that slack by tightening down the tensioning bolt. As we tighten the tensioning bolt, it pulls the alternator away from the motor and pulls those nice and tight. Don't want to pull these too tight, but you also don't want to set them too loose. It takes a specialized tool to properly test the tension, which is something that me and most people working on their own Miata will not have available. So you're just going to go ahead and set it so that it feels nice and firm, and you can adjust it later if you have issues with belt squeal. Next, now that we have the tension set properly, we're going to set this locking bottom bolt in place. So just go ahead and tighten that all the way down. It'll prevent the alternator from having any sort of wiggle to it, and get it good and tight and make sure that you don't have to do any belt adjustments once you've got it locked and good. Now next, we're going to need to set up this power output of the alternator. Now just go ahead and slide that ring terminal over the bolt there, the stud, and before you put the nut on, we actually want to check and make sure that it is spun toward the front of the car. So where that terminal connects, we've got some wire, and we want to make sure it's away from the intake manifold support brace that we'll be installing. Make sure that you've got it pointed toward the front of the car before you bolt it down. Now we've got this connector, and that should plug in pretty easily, but you want to listen for the audible click when you're installing it. What you don't want is to be chasing down electrical issues and find out that you didn't properly plug in this connector. So make sure you've got that good audible click. The next thing I do is take some soapy water, just Dawn dish soap and water, go ahead and spray it down there on the alternator belt. This will help me tell if the belt needs to be tensioned up some more, because we'll get a squealing sound when we start up the car if the belt tension isn't set properly. Reconnect that battery terminal and go ahead and start up the car. I've got some multimeter leads hooked up here, and we should be measuring with the car running 13.6 volts, and that is absolutely perfect. Now, if you had a problem with the car, we'd be getting something more like 12.6 or 12.8 volts. Anything under 13.5, there's likely to be an issue with the car, and you'll want to readdress this more.